Good morning, everybody. Welcome, no matter where you're at, whether it's morning, afternoon, evening, and wherever you're coming in from. We want to welcome you to the Society for Medical Decision Making's live webinar titled COVID-19 Decision Models, Connecting Modelers and Decision Makers. To give you a little background, this webinar will have 3 panels, concluding remarks, and an open mic session afterwards that are all hosted by the COVID-19 Modeling Committee of SMDM. And this committee was formed at the beginning of the pandemic, very close to the beginning of the pandemic, to find ways to have a positive impact during the pandemic. We started the work together as a committee in March of 2020. And interestingly, we submitted a grant to the Moore Foundation exactly 1 year ago today. I was looking up when everything got going, and April 28th, 2020 was when we submitted the proposal that was titled SMDM COVID-19 Modeling Grants Program, Catalyzing Immediate Impact Where Needed. With the leadership of committee, the SMDM committee's co-chairs, myself, Jillian Sanders-Schmidler here, and Lisa Prosser, and our universities, we were able to launch a grants program to support a cohort of modeling teams through a competitive selection process. And the SMDM COVID Modeling Committee did an incredible job reviewing over 60 impressive proposals. We had people at our universities helping us, the committee helping us, and we ultimately selected 9 teams that we expected would deliver rapid impact by connecting their excellent decision modeling work and progressing that with real-world decision-making needs and the decision makers who are having to make those decisions. The 9 teams presented their projects at our SMDM annual meeting last fall when they had made quite a bit of significant progress towards their goals and the overarching goals of the grants program. They've been continuing their efforts and concluding with papers and talks in other places and work with decision makers. So really impressive impact, and we're eager to learn lessons as a group. So we're hosting this webinar today to disseminate the work that's been done so far and have a chance to appreciate that together during this time of continued need. And then we also hope to see through this webinar our ability to encourage our community to support each other and reflect our shared SMDM values, which are on our website as, what SMDM is. We are an international transdisciplinary group drawn together by our commitment to improving the health of individuals and populations. So this webinar is part of that, and the grants program is certainly an important manifestation of that during this particular time. I'm going to turn it over to Jillian Sanders-Schmidler to talk about a little bit more about the grants program's extra resources of support and activities that have been occurring simultaneously.
Thank you, Kathy. So in addition to the work that you're going to hear about shortly from the grantees, I want to just give you a brief update on some of the other initiatives that we've been working on related to the COVID-19 modeling within SMDM. First, as many of you know, we established a repository of decision models for decision makers responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Our goal was to provide a method of connecting the needs of diverse decision makers to evidence-based decision models, which can be used to inform timely response to the pandemic. The repository currently has about 100 models that have been submitted, and it includes information about the models, their underlying evidence, the outcomes that are assessed, how they're dealing with uncertainty, and the availability of the models to the public. We've also created a questions portal that was collecting questions relevant to policymakers, clinical decision makers, or clinical providers, and health system administrators. We looked for questions that targeted decisions involving choices related to public health interventions, to diagnostic testing and evaluation, to health system operations, treatment and vaccination, and then individual and population well-being. We've compiled the questions by different stakeholder perspectives. And then these questions helped prioritize the decision modeling work that you're going to hear about today. And both of those efforts are still ongoing, and certainly looking for additional models and questions. As everyone knows, the questions that are most timely are changing as we go. And there's, both need for the modeling work that you're going to hear about today, but modeling work going forward to address some of those more timely clinical and policy questions over the course of the pandemic. So turning back to Kathy.
Great, thanks, Jillian. And you're going to hear from Lisa afterwards as we do concluding remarks with Harvey Feinberg. So what I wanted to just add at this point for context is that in addition to SMDM's role on this particular set of grants, the 9 that you'll be hearing from today, we also had the opportunity to extend our work in being a committee and a community who could help foundations do more quickly through our network and our abilities to be able to do a good selection process by another grant program with the Rockefeller Foundation. So the Moore Foundation introduced us to the Rockefeller Foundation and some of the activities that foundation was that they're focused on during the pandemic, and continued to some degree the efforts that were underway with the Moore Foundation by developing another round of grant support for modeling teams with a slightly different scope, but still very much core to it, meeting decision makers' needs. So that's going now, and you can look forward to hearing from the grantees that we are in the process of awarding grants to and working with in another cohort. There are a few in this group that are moving into that group, and we're really looking forward to continuing this this effort to share our knowledge together and have an impact together. So just wanted to let everybody know that that's going on, and let's get into the meat of the program, really understanding what our projects have been doing and where they've gone and where they've arrived, and have a chance for questions and answers. We have 3 panels, each is moderated by a member of our committee. The members of the committee are listed on the CDMI web page. I hope you get a chance to look at who participated. I want to thank, it's been a whole village, a whole bunch of people who've been involved in this. So I'm not going to go through all the names, but it's incredible. And we're going to start with the first panel, and that's moderated by Beata Sander. So please, I welcome Beata to take us into the first panel, and then we'll continue on to the second panel and the third panel and the concluding remarks and the open mic. So here we go.
Thanks so much, Kathy. And yes, welcome everyone. I'm super excited kicking off the first panel of the day. Excellent speakers lined up. It's the who of modeling, I think, throughout the whole morning for me, afternoon probably for others. And it's also really amazing to see you all and see all my friends here. So really, really amazing day. I think I should just introduce myself briefly. I think most of you know me. I'm Beata Sander. I'm a Canada Research Chair in Economics of Infectious Diseases, scientist at the University Health Network, and associate professor at the Institute for Health Policy Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto in Toronto, Canada. And I will jump right in. Just first, a quick reminder that please add your questions in the Q&A box. The next 35 minutes, the way it's structured, we will have very brief presentations by each of the team for about 5 minutes each, and then we go straight into our discussions. And our first speaker is Dr. Fernando Alavet Escoedo. He is an assistant professor at the Drug Policy Program at the Center for Research and Teaching and Economics in Mexico. And Fernando, I have to apologize big time because I forgot the name of the city, and it's really, really embarrassing, but I'm sure you will correct me. And so Fernando will speak to COVID-19 policy options in Mexico City. So I will hand it over to you, Fernando.
Hi, Beate, and hi, everyone. Thank you, Viati, for introducing me. And the name is Aguascalientes, which means hot springs in English. And I thank SMDM and the More Foundation for giving this opportunity to represent my team, which is a collaboration between CIDE, the institution where I'm based in Aguascalientes, and Stanford University. The work that I'll present today is on the effect of different end of year holiday contexts on potential non-pharmaceutical interventions to mitigate the pandemic in Mexico City metropolitan area. Next, please. I would like to thank my collaborators of the whole Stanford City Coronavirus Simulation Modeling Consortium. With all their support have made this project and results and outcomes happen. Next, please. So my work is based on the late 2020. So MCMA, which is Mexico City metropolitan area, had the largest number of COVID, or still has the largest number of COVID-19 epidemic cases in Mexico, and was at risk of exceeding its hospital capacity in late December 2020. Traditional end-of-year holiday festivities in Mexico led or encouraged many people to gather, mix, mingle, and that presented big challenges for Mexico, specifically because we saw at the time an increase in the rise of cases in all countries, but specifically in Mexico City metropolitan area. We did not have any massive vaccination policies in place, so MPS were the primary means of controlling the epidemic at that time. Next, please. So the aim of this grant and this project, which was funded by the More Foundation through SMDM, was to estimate what will be the potential effects of increased end-of-year holiday context and of different potential increases on COVID-19 cases, deaths, and healthcare outcomes in the city. We also aim to estimate the potential for policies and hospital capacity expansion to mitigate the risk of this hospital system capacity being exceeded. So we provided different assessments based on our SC Cosmo model of different policy alternatives to inform Mexico City's decision makers on how much hospital capacity expansion would be needed to be able to provide and fulfill the potentially increased demand. We focusing on strengthening current social distancing policies or either remaining status quo, or also resume in-person school in early 2021. There was some discussion at the time whether it was a good time to resume in-person schooling or not, so we evaluate this scenario. Next, please. What we found is that we were effective reproduction number above 1, which meant that epidemic was hot, that is like epidemic was still on the rise. Although effective reproduction number was declining, we still had values or greater than 1. In late 2020, and they say, what would happen if this end-of-year holiday context would increase? Well, it would directly impact effective reproduction number and would have a significant increase, and that increase would permeate over a long period of time, depending on the policy that was implemented. An effective reproduction number greater than 1 implied that the epidemic will continue to rise. So we saw that did impose difficulties on resuming in-person schooling. Next, please. What we found is that there was a high risk of exceeding hospital capacity, even under current level of context. Next, please. And we saw that this hospital capacity being exceeded was basically defined by the number of contacts 2 months prior of seeing this high magnitude of hospital demand being seen in early 2021. Next, please. And of course, this demand would be a function of how many contacts or the level of contacts by how much it would increase at the end of your holiday context. Next, please. We also find that avoiding massive surging in hospitalization may require stricter social distancing and not to reopen in schools. Next, please. So, yeah, next, thank you. And finally, we found that under almost all scenarios, exceeding hospital capacity for a month is highly likely. No matter what would be done, unless social distancing would be should be tightened, there was a high risk of exceeding this hospital capacity. So next, please. Our work was picked up by national and international media, making some awareness and also probably make it broadly available that the city was at high risk of exceeding hospital capacity, and that perhaps it would impose a high pressure to the system. Next, please. And with this, I conclude my presentation, and thank you again for joining the webinar, and we look forward to your questions and comments.
Thanks so much, Fernando. I think we'll be moving straight to the next presentation before we then have the overall panel discussion. And so I'd like to ask Dr. Beata Jan and Dr. Uwe Siebert to turn on their cameras if you haven't yet. I can see you right now. There you are. Okay, perfect. And maybe advance to the, yes, the title slide already. So next up, Dr. Beata Jan and Dr. Uwe Siebert, both professors at the University for Health Sciences and Medical Informatics and Technology in Halle, Austria. And they will be speaking to us about how decision models informed decision-making in Austria, specifically around vaccination. So over to you, Uwe.
Thank you, Beata, and hello to everybody. I'm going to now, together with Uwe Siebert, present the project Targeted Vaccination Strategies. But before I start, I would like to thank the team, the entire team from UMIT, DWH Technical University of Vienna, and the DEXHELP Modeling Consortium for their tremendous support. And our standing policy and expert panel, which consists of leading decision makers from 4 Austrian decision-making and policy advisory bodies, as well as clinical, ethics, and international modeling experts. Please slide, please. Next slide, please. Thanks to the donors and the organizers of this exciting event. Next slide. It is amazing to see how fast the development and distribution of vaccines progresses. Some leading countries are at the vaccination rate of 40% or more. However, in general, COVID-19 vaccine supply is still limited. When we started our project, first vaccines were entering phase 3 clinical trials, and our aim was to inform decision makers at an early stage about targeted COVID-19 vaccination strategies, accounting for limited capacities and adherence to support vaccination prioritization in Austria. We applied an agent-based population model, next slide please, to evaluate what effect does the vaccination of different target groups have on different outcomes, our first question. We assumed an initially limited number of vaccinations. We considered 5 different population groups. After vaccinating first 200,000 individuals in the 5 groups, the spread of the disease in the population is monitored over 6 months, and the relative reduction compared to no vaccination is calculated based on death, hospitalization, intensive care unit use, positive tests, etc. Thereafter, we applied a sequential optimization focusing on hospitalizations and deaths for the subsequent vaccine batches. Next slide, please. So, what effect does the vaccination of different target group have? Here we see the non-sterilizing vaccination of the first 200,000 people, assuming an effectiveness of 70%. The maximum reduction of hospitalization and death was achieved by starting vaccination with the elderly and vulnerable, followed by the middle-aged, healthcare workers, and younger. Next slide, please. Optimizations for vaccination 2.5 million individuals yielded the same prioritization strategy, with the elderly continuing with the vulnerable. It avoided approximately 1/3 of deaths and hospitalizations. Starting vaccinations with healthcare workers led to slightly smaller reduction, but it maximizes occupational safety. Next slide. Together with our standing policy and expert panel, we identified just in time an optimized prioritization rule. Our strategy, starting with the elderly, followed by vulnerable person, was informed and is in line with the implemented vaccination strategy in Austria. Protection of healthcare workers may receive a higher priority in order to maximize their occupational safety and to ensure risk compensatory justice, an important additional ethical aspect complementing our modeling results. And our panel continues to support further COVID-19 projects and preparedness activities. Now, Uwe, as a co-PI, will say a few words on dissemination and impact.
As this is a project with the explicit purpose of directly guiding policy decision-making, throughout the entire project, we strongly focused already on direct information exchange with the Austrian authorities. When we first started the project, the Austrian government planned to prioritize healthcare workers in the vaccination strategy. During the project, decision makers were involved in all aspects, ranging from data collection to visualization of results, communication of results. And after the project, the final decision of the Austrian government was in line with our recommendation to start vaccinating the elderly and vulnerable. Dr. Jan and the team did an excellent job, not only having continuous contact with the Austrian Vaccination Commission, but also being fast with promoting the results to the public through newspapers, TV, social media, also scientific community channels. Finally, as we update our model with incoming evidence, we continue our collaboration with the decision maker, as mentioned, in preparedness research in a sustainable way, keeping the standing policy and expert panel involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pierre and Uwe, and I'll be moving on to the last speaker for the first panel. Thanks for moving the slides. I think Eva and Shazad, you're up on camera. Thanks so much. So yes, so next speakers are Dr. Eva Jean-Baptiste, who is the Associate Professor in Health Economics, and Dr. Shazad Ali, who is Canada Research Chair in Public Health Economics and Associate Professor, both at Western University in London, Ontario, in Canada. So welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Beate. I'll make a start and then Eva will join. Our project primarily focused on COVID-19 models and social determinants of health. The project was led by Eva and myself. We are both at Western, as you said. We have an excellent team of experts who are based in 3 countries, and the list is here. Next slide, please. So the project was motivated by the evidence that emerged fairly early on in the course of the pandemic, which found that the pandemic has disproportionately affected marginalized communities, and that social determinants of health, such as socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, gender, age, they play a critical role in the spread of the infection as well as its impact on communities. However, many infectious disease models, particularly those that were produced in the early phase of the pandemic, were based on a population average approach and often ignored the social factors in predicting the course of the pandemic, as well as evaluating impact of policy options. So this is where our project came in to fill this evidence gap. There are multiple components to this project, including 2 surveys that are currently in process, but here we will only focus on the 2 systematic reviews. The first systematic review looks at infectious disease modeling guidelines to understand the recommended approaches for incorporating social determinants of health in ID models. And this systematic review of guidelines was not restricted to COVID-19, but we looked at all infectious disease models. And the second systematic review focuses primarily on COVID-19 models and evaluates if and how these models incorporate social factors. Next slide, please. So we searched the typical database that you normally look at. We looked at Medline, Embase, Cochrane Library, Web of Science, and as well as the Gray literature. And the search was conducted on the 31st of October and last year. And we identified 19 guideline studies. Please, next slide, please. And what we found was that there were 13 out of these 19 studies that focused on infectious diseases in general. And then there were other guidelines that focused on one specific infectious disease each. And the bottom graph shows that the social factors, there were multiple social factors that were included in these guidelines. 14 out of 19 guidelines made direct and specific reference to at least one social factor when developing infectious disease models, and made specific recommendations in those areas. Age was the most commonly recommended social factor across all guidelines. 11 studies mentioned incorporating age, followed by sex and gender and socioeconomic status, deprivation, marginalization in 5 studies, and 3 studies mentioned race and ethnicity, and there were a number of other factors that were mentioned as well. Next slide, please. So by far the most common, so we looked at what are the reasons that recommended in these guidelines for incorporating social factors. By far the most common argument for suggesting that social factors be incorporated in models is that they improve model accuracy and precision. For instance, age and demographic structures are related to host susceptibility, contact patterns, contact networks, mixing patterns, and these in turn predict the spread of the epidemic and its impact. The second consideration is heterogeneity of policy treatment effects, as well as preventative behaviors that often are socially distributed. For example, lockdowns may have different social mix, may have differential impact across social groups on social mixing patterns. Interestingly, only a handful of guidelines explicitly mentioned about inequities, and they suggest that models that ignore social determinants of health may in fact exacerbate inequities. Next slide, please. And finally, guidelines also talk about technical considerations. So they also talk about the fact that if you want to incorporate social factors, you're thinking about computationally more intensive and data-hungry models, which are often challenging and often based on surveillance data that are hard to get, and they may not appropriately represent all communities. The bottom line is that all models and modelers should ask, are there identifiable groups with different levels of risk that should be incorporated in these models?
Next slide, please. So we conducted a systematic review of COVID-19 models that included social factors, searching the standard citation indices and archives between December 1st, 2019 and August 2020. We identified 85 published studies, 295 preprints. This presentation is focused on the published studies. Next slide, please. The goals of modeling included predicting the pandemic, 71 of 85, assessing the impact on of policies or interventions, 47, and assessing the impact of health services, 31, and many had multiple goals. Most models were mathematical compartmental models at 45, fewer were regression-based, 20, or agent-based models, 11. Age was the most included social factor, 75 of 85, followed by sex and gender, 12, race and ethnicity, and occupational factors, 7 each. And just highlighting that very few focused on household density or refugees and migrants, for example, at 4 each. Next slide, please. Regression models more often incorporated non-age social factors, 12 of 20, compared to agent-based models or mathematical compartmental models. The ecological approach to social factors in regression models, where area level measures such as neighborhood deprivation, racial or ethnic concentration, was useful for predicting the pandemic. In other words, identifying hotspots, but not for evaluating policies or interventions. Next slide, please. Here are the implications of our findings as we see them. Modelers should work with stakeholders to formulate research questions that reflect disparities in health and non-health burden, differential access to care, heterogeneity in policy impact, and the values and preferences of important social groups. Decision makers are encouraged to fund the infrastructure required to support modeling complexity so that social factors can be incorporated. Large modeling collaborations are encouraged as they can pool intellectual capital and advocate for resources to develop complex models that reflect social heterogeneity, and also advocate for develop improved data sets that are required to support inclusion of social factors in models. For example, contact matrices should account for things like occupational risk, race and ethnicity, and household composition. I'd like to thank the funders and as well thank all who have participated today and welcome questions.
Thank you very much to all the speakers for free, and thanks extra thanks for staying perfectly on time. Actually, that's amazing. So thank you. I would like to ask all the speakers to please turn on your cameras. And with this, we are opening it for discussions. Reminder, please put your questions into the Q&A and I will be reading the questions as they come in. Maybe to kick it off, just one general questions around, I think Uwe, you touched on that already specifically, but around policy impact. And so kind of looking back, I think so much has changed, right? I see like some of the models started very early and how things evolved over time, and maybe just reflect back on where you kind of, where you started, how it started and how it's going now. You want to start, Fernando?
Sorry, I lost a little bit of the connection. Would you mind repeating that, please?
Yeah, just general reflections on kind of impact on policy. I think how things started. Your work was done quite a while ago, and where are things going? What are you doing now? How things evolved over time?
Sure. Thank you. Yes. So our work, when we presented it, was at a time that there was a big push towards doing something in Mexico, like strengthening social distancing, which was not encouraged at the time. So when we revealed our results and presented and made them public through a preprint, that caused some media attention to try to motivate strengthening social distancing at the time, and also create awareness that hospital capacity might be exceeded early 2021, and that most likely there won't be a possibility to reopen in-person schooling. So we continued providing more detailed information that we did not present in the preprint, but some sub-scenarios that some decision makers were interested in having. And that was helpful in making some decision at the time. Since then, we've been implemented or run different vaccination scenarios. Mexico has since started implementing massive vaccination policies, which have been differentiated at different states. So we have adapted our model to all the states in Mexico, calibrated to all the states, and then run different state-specific vaccination policies. We will continue doing that, and we have also incorporated potential variants. We don't have information on which variants are present in Mexico at a population level, but we have conducted different what-if scenarios if, in case there's been different levels of the variants being present in Mexico. So to summarize, we've now incorporated vaccination and potential variants and see what would be the implications of different policies. For example, reopening schools in the next semester, whether it would be feasible or not, depending on what scenario we are in fact living in.
Thanks, Fernando. I want to Beata and Uwe, you can comment because you just touched on vaccination. And I actually, one question I had, like your work initially seemed to focus on reducing severe outcomes. And that's, I think, how all countries started thinking about prioritization. And then at least from the Canadian perspective, and especially Ontario perspective, this kind of changed over time, where was so moving from preventing severe disease to kind of evaluating this and looking at reducing transmission, which is quite a different approach, a bit away from the very age-based approach that many countries have been pushing for in the beginning. So I wonder if you can comment on that, whether this also changed over time in Austria and how the modeling may have been helpful on that.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to give you a little bit of background how we incorporate the decision makers, and specifically also touching on this question. So when we had our first presentation, we framed or set up our expert panel at the very beginning and really took them with us, starting with the research question. And after our first expert panel meeting where we had already representatives of the screening committee in Austria with us, we were then a couple of days later actually invited by the screening committee to present what we have been doing and how we would structure it. And one important question was, okay, what would be the main outcome? So what, especially in this optimization process that we did, what would they like to focus on? And there was a big discussion on, there was one half focusing on hospitalizations. So to keep up keep the system running, and then the others focusing on rather death as the main outcome parameter. And so we ended up doing our optimizations for both outcome parameters, hospitalization and death. And in the end, we found that the strategy to vaccinate the elderly followed by the vulnerable, actually this was a strategy that was a result in both optimization processes that we saw. And one aspect, how to incorporate now the healthcare workers, here we faced it a little bit more difficult because we could not incorporate the entire impact of vaccinating the healthcare workers in our model. So what we were very careful, and I think this was important at the end of the project, when we were really sitting together with our standing policy and advisory panel and looking at the results, that all of us, we were then together phrasing the wording, how we interpret our results, also taking into account, as I said, ethical aspects that we don't incorporate in our modeling, but we should consider, for example, with respect to ethics in thinking about how to deal now with healthcare workers. But Uwe, maybe you want to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I think what we had to make sure is to show that this was a project with decision under temporary restriction. So we're all used to, limited resource, and usually it means budget or money. So this was under limited research, but temporary. So the very important thing was that you don't tell people, well, you're a healthcare worker, you're less important or something like that, because the opposite is, of course, the case. And to make clear also to the public that this is a question of what do we do until we have enough vaccination. And in the communication, it was important because initially there was the belief, well, if you vaccinate the healthcare workers, it's like, they are the wall. No virus can get in and out through the wall of healthcare workers because they are the distributors, the disseminators, and everybody will be saved if they just a safe wall. Now, we all know that that's not true, and it was very important to show that vaccinating younger people is actually more effective in reducing the spread. So we showed that little bars on one end, but the difference was small, and it would cost much more lives of the elderly if you do that, and to show that, and then tell people, but how can that be? The disseminators are not vaccinated. Tell them that's already incorporated. So would we vaccinate them, we would gain even more, but the ongoing dissemination through healthcare workers kills people, and that's already incorporated still the net, in the net we save lives. I think that was important. And then we took, the paper was just published today, it went online today, so it's like a celebration moment. And you may look how we formulated the ethical issues, because you could say, no matter how much life it costs, if you send people, the healthcare workers, to a war, you have to give them a helmet because they cannot choose. I mean, an elderly person in principle, may be able to say, I'm gonna stay, for the next half year alone in my room. In principle, I'm not saying that that's a real choice, but the healthcare workers, they don't have a choice. So if you force them basically to work, then that may be an ethical reason to give them protection, even if it costs lives. That's another, that's more like, you may call it some other type of protection or ethical principle you use here. It's, protecting the solidarity basically and helping those who are fighting at the front. So you could come to another conclusion, but most people would say, well, if they are willing to do their work not vaccinated, we agree that it's better to save the lives of the elderly first. So it was the other way around in Austria. They first wanted to start on healthcare workers, and then I don't know whether it was us and the continuing talks of Beate and others, or it was just that in the end they, were more reasonably anyway. So it was a very interesting experience.
Thanks so much. It's actually really amazing how you guys kind of connect each of the talks. There are two questions, but before I read them, I do want to give Eva and Shazette an opportunity to comment, especially I think extending it to, so you talk about ethics, and I want to kind of focus on equity and any comments and you want to make maybe related to vaccination. We talked about hotspots a lot in Ontario, but I think I would like you, if you can comment on that, would be great.
Just go ahead. I think you comment.
No, thank you, Beate. I think the models, when we started looking at these models last year, I think models have come along a long way. When we started looking at these population average models last year, people did not really care about social factors. And slowly and gradually what we have seen, age and some of the other social groups are currently being incorporated. But I think it's still a big missing piece in the puzzle. So when we talk about vaccination, there is a lot of misinformation that is out there, which is not commonly modeled in terms of a policy direction. So we have seen studies that have clearly shown that vaccine hesitancy, misinformation is particularly more prevalent in certain communities compared to others. But when we see models, we don't see a lot of models that look at these health promotion, health education type of policy interventions that are targeting specific communities where these interventions are less likely to be taken up. Also, it's interesting that health system, protecting the health system has been at the forefront of the discussion. But at the same time, there is some discussion, there's significant discussion, I would say, but not enough about workers who are not working in the health system, people who are, we're talking about marginalized communities. Also, they do not have a choice to stay at home, particularly when you've got large families working and living in multi-generational households. These people also are going out there in the community, taking a lot of risk. So I think what I've seen is that more work needs to be done in this space, and modelers kind of need to take this on board a bit more. I'll stop here.
And I'll just add to that. I think one of the points that we tried to convey is that we do need to develop the infrastructure that's required to incorporate social factors into models. And I think in part, the reason that the trends has improved as time has gone on is because people have realized these shortfalls and made attempts to address those. But the challenge is that we need to be better prepared as a research community in light of the fact that there may be another pandemic, unfortunately, and that we need to take advantage of this opportunity to develop the data that's required. And then also there was a question about the range of countries represented in this systematic review. It was quite a broad range of countries. I haven't summarized that, but included at least 10 countries, and many studies looked at multiple countries, in short.
Thank you very much. I think we are pretty much out of time, but because I didn't read a single question, I will put up one for 1 minute for a 1 minute answer. So it's around uncertainty. So kind of especially early on, lack of data that we all had to deal with. And so the questions around how do you deal with lack of data? How do you reflect uncertainty? How do you validate your model as more data became available? And I would say maybe Fernando and Beata and Uwe, 1 minute max. Together.
Okay, I could just go very quickly. So with the lack of evidence, at least for the setting where we are doing modeling, what we did is like transportability of evidence, and then did some scenario analysis. What if it was greater than or lower than the particular value that we got from different setting? And then we did validate our model by seeing how much our predictions based on some different scenarios that we saw held based on what we did several weeks or even months prior, and see how our model was validated. Of course, perhaps it's the same for all the groups. Our models have been evolved quite a bit since we created them, at least us a bit over a year ago. It's not the same model that we started with. So it's been evolved both in its structure and also the evidence goes into it.
Okay, thank you. Beata, over 1 second comment.
Yeah, so with respect to uncertainty, well, it depends a little bit on the parameter. But for example, with respect to whether the vaccine would be sterilizing or not sterilizing or something like this, we were modeling the two extremes, and then so that we would see the range how it would go with respect to effectiveness of the vaccine. Well, we build on kind of expert opinion that we have in our panel. And we are now, and since we were evaluating it with 70% effectiveness, we are now reanalyzing our model as we also proposed in the submission of this grant. And with respect to, for example, uptake of the vaccine, here also we need to rely on expert opinion and their experiences that they had from other vaccination campaigns and so on in Austria. And with respect to uncertainty, well, here since it is an agent-based model, so an individual level model, here we had to do repeated runs in order to get stable results, and also the model is calibrated regularly to Austrian data that we see of the spread of the disease. Uwe?
Yeah, just to add that we also did a sensitivity analysis for effectiveness, which was the big, unknown, between 70 and 100%, and we showed that in the initial phase, I mean, this is even common sense. You don't need modeling, I guess. In the initial phase, when you don't really affect the overall spread so much, you don't get to herd immunity, it doesn't matter. So the sequence was the same in the 100%.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. So there are more questions in the chat, but I think they can also apply for the next panel and the next second and third panel. So keep the questions coming. There's more time to ask and discuss. Thank you very much to the first speakers this morning, Fernando, Beata, Uwe, Eva, and Shazad.